Good morning. Here we go with another episode of Existential Ambiguity. That title is such a mouthful. Try saying it real fast a few times. Anyway, this is the 14th episode in our continuing series on R.G.D.S. Wetimuni's very important book, The Buddha's Teaching and the Ambiguity of Existence. And this book is so important because it builds a bridge between the best thinking in the East and the West. And the best thinking we feel in the East is the teaching of the Buddha. And in the West, it's existentialism. Because existentialism as a philosophy created, or I should say, corrected many of the mistakes of scientific positivism, which had been in vogue since the so-called Enlightenment. Not. And it actually brought a level of maturity into Western thinking that had not been present there in so-called scientific thinking. Because scientific thinking is actually a form of religion where they keep adjusting the assumptions until the equations come out right.
And they remove the primary thing, which is your own consciousness.
Yes. Now, they tried to reintroduce the observer in quantum mechanics.
Yeah. But it's too
late.
The horse is out of the barn, man.
Yeah, it's too late because their whole basis is already
wrong.
Yeah, completely wrong. Because without the scientist, there is no science. The subjective is actually more important than the so-called objective. And if we go into the Buddha's teaching, we'll see that there actually is no such thing as objective reality. There is no one world that everybody shares. Everybody has their own world of subjectivity. And we're going to start talking about this now in the chapter 5.
And it seems to me that if there was like a consensus that everyone's subjective world was more important than the objective truth, it would be a more humane worldview.
Well, yeah, because one of the first things they teach you when you go to school is that what you think doesn't matter.
No. And your importance is only as far as you're valuable to some group.
Yes, and you can duplicate the thoughts of some other thinkers, and that's good. That's rewarded.
If you can do that.
But if you come up with anything on your own, that's not acceptable.
No.
And if you have feelings about something, that's just in your mind.
Just imagination.
Yeah. It's just your imagination. Well, these are the consequences of so-called objective reality.
Crazy-making business.
It is. It's a crazy-making business because, after all, we live in our subjectivity. We don't live in any objective world. Maybe there are some objects out there that really are there. And we can share them and stuff like that. But to say that there is only one reality is blatantly ignoring the actual reality that everybody looks at things differently from their own point of view. You can't have it both ways. Either there is a world which everyone sees according to their own point of view, and therefore everybody has a different viewpoint, and sees a different world, or there is one objective reality and everybody sees it the same. Now, since the so-called Enlightenment, the powers that be have been trying to impose this one world objective reality view on people, but it hasn't worked. We still have a world full of people, each one seeing things differently. So why hasn't this worked? I mean, it was a great idea. It looked good on paper. But the implementation has failed, and it has actually damaged people's intelligence by putting them through school.
Yeah.
One of the things that we have to deal with when we teach Buddha's teaching to people is that when Buddha created this teaching, there was no such thing as school. There was no such thing as state-mandated, state-regulated education.
No. There were only some really skillful people that were hired in to teach.
Yeah, if you were fortunate to be born in an opulent family, they'd bring in a brahmana or two to tutor the kids. That's how you learn stuff, or you just learn from life.
Yeah.
And if you were really lucky, you got to apprentice with a sage, someone who actually realized something, who actually knew something.
So we think that everyone has the right to have an education. Like that's the stated goal of so-called education.
But real education is self-education. Nobody learns, nobody can be taught. Everyone can learn. And school, more often than not, gets in the way of people learning. By trying to force them into this preconceived mold of information which has been dictated by the state.
It's not learning, it's memorizing.
Yeah, that's not really learning.
No, it's
learning,
stuff that you don't want to learn, really.
Yeah, learning means acquiring skills that you have an interest in and that you're going to use in life.
Yeah.
And that we have to do in our own time.
The situation now is people go 12 years to school, and when they come out, many of them can't even read because they've been forced to assimilate all this stupid stuff.
Not only that, they have lost their taste for learning. School has beat it out of them, bullied it out of them. There's one big bully called the teacher, and he stands up, or she stands up in front of the room and tells you will think of this and that. And then the bell rings, and then we're going to think of something else.
Yes, stop concentrating.
Nearly. Break your train of thought every 45 minutes and go on to a new subject mandated by a schedule. It's brutal.
Yeah.
No wonder the kids start bullying each other because they're given a perfect example in the teacher and the school administration.
And even if it's a good teacher, he is being bullied by the big system above him.
Right. It's no wonder that the school doesn't work. It can't work. It's really not about learning or education at all. It's simply about social conditioning.
Yes.
And that it does very, very well. By the time people get out of school, they're so fried that they don't want to learn anything anymore, and they don't. They stop learning, and they just become workers, drones, who go to the office every day and do the same thing over and over again and play around with office politics and all the rest of that nonsense.
Play high school games in office environments.
Yeah. Now we're going to go into the pieces that make up the world that we see. And these are called the 5 clinging aggregates.
Because in the beginning we cling to them.
That's right. We're starting from the level of the ordinary person. We're not going to start by trying to describe the Buddha's reality.
Because that can't be explained, really.
Well, it can be explained, but nobody would understand it.
And it's probably much more than what you could explain it, like how it is as opposed to the Puthujjana, but it would also say that speculating about how reality is for a Buddha is crazy making business.
Right. Well, what you can say about a Buddha's reality is that there are no clinging aggregates because there's no clinging.
There's no clinging to the aggregates. There are only the aggregates.
Right. The clinging is gone. But in the Puthujjana, in the ordinary person, everything is clung to.
Yes.
So we're going to start from there. First of all, let's take a look at this word Puthujjana, because we're going to be using it a lot. And we want to define it according to the Pali dictionary.
They're going to have to learn some Pali words now.
Well, yeah, because there are no English or Western language terms that mean these things. It's funny because in Greek, there is an expression, hoi polloi, that means approximately the same thing as putujana. It means just an ordinary person, just a run-of-the-mill, spiritually untrained person.
And many religions have this uninitiated, like gojim.
Yes, right. What is it? Worthy Oriental gentleman. Putujana.
But we have to learn the shop talk of the Seka.
Well, yeah, there are three kinds of people, the Putujana, the Seka, and the Arhat. We are Putujanas trying to become Sekas. And so the first thing we have to learn is the language of the teaching. Otherwise, how can we learn the teaching? This is two words, compound word, putu and jana. Putu comes from Sanskrit pritak or pritu, which means like broad, spread out, far and wide, flat. And if you go to India, most of India is flatter than a pancake. And it just is river country, where these huge rivers have over many millions of years deposited their sediments, and there's excellent farming land, and water is available because of the rivers that come down from the Himalaya, the big mountains in the north. Pritak can also mean separated, individual, one by one. So the putu in Pali has two senses, one of which is this individual, separated, and the other one is like common, ordinary, many, numerous, several. So you have many individuals
who are the
jhana.
same.
Yeah, and they're virtually the same. There might be a few individual differences, but as far as their consciousness, the principle of their consciousness is practically speaking the same.
Some different tastes, but the dynamics of their consciousness, they operate in the same way.
Yeah, right. So the putujana is a generic term for an uninstructed person, an ordinary person who has not been through the training given by the Buddha. We're going to examine, or we've actually been examining so far, the structure of the Putujana's consciousness with regards to clinging. And in chapter 4, which was the last, 10 episodes or something like that, we went into detail, into root structure of this clinging process. How the Putujana takes their immediate experience and turns it into I and mine. Okay, so we went into that in amazing detail. Now we're going to talk about what is being clung to.
Yeah.
Okay, so Weti Muni he opens up chapter 5 by saying, now that we have developed the structure of holding or clinging, we need a sufficiently detailed understanding of what is held or clung to. What is considered I and mine? There's always something. There's no such thing as an unsupported awareness, pure consciousness or whatever.
Even if you imagine the pure I, that's just a sankhara, a thought in your mind, an idea.
Yeah, it's not real. In practice, I or mine is always in reference to some object. Well, what are these objects? That's what we're going to talk about now. The Buddha teaches that there can only be holding or clinging to one or more of 5 things he designates as the 5 khanda. We can render khanda as aggregates. Other suitable translations would be group, mass, or totality. But aggregates means, according to Oxford, aggregate, a whole, formed by combining several typically disparate elements, or a material or structure formed from a loosely compacted mass of fragments or particles. I think the first definition is better. a whole formed by combining several typically disparate elements.
Disparate?
Disparate means essentially different in kind, not allowing comparison, very different from one another. So the things that go together into these 5 aggregates may be different from one another, but they share a certain function.
They're also related and they're part of the same thing. Sometimes it's difficult to... you can't really separate them.
Well, let's take the first aggregate. The first aggregate is matter or form. Rupa. Okay, rupa is again another word derived from Sanskrit that means form. And of course anything with form is also matter, whether subtle or gross.
Yeah.
And matter has a bewildering array of different types, qualities, and so on. But it does serve a particular function. What is that? Form. It makes form. And we cannot cognize something without form. If we see an object, if we make something ours, it has to have some form to it. It can't be formless. Or you could say, well, just a lump of modeling clay or something like that is formless. Well, not really. No matter how lumpy it may be, it has a definite form. Even a cloud of gas or something like that has a form, no matter how diffuse it may be. Okay, so the 5 aggregates, or khanda, are matter or form, rupa, feeling, vedana, perception, sanya, determinations, sankhara, and consciousness, vijnana.
So the first one has definite form, but the other ones are formless.
It's kind of irrelevant because they're not things. They are processes, feeling, perception, determinations, which are also sometimes called fabrications, and consciousness aren't things. They're processes. They're stuff that goes on in the mind. It's software.
But in Pali, they could be translated dhammas, which would be things. But they
all
aren't
of them,
all
of them would be dhammas. All of them, even the matter or form, would be dhamma. Dhamma with the long A at the end.
And it should also be said that matter or form can be mental images.
Well, feeling is also a mental thing, but it's not an image.
No,
but it doesn't have a form.
Form is not only physical form.
Right.
It's also mental images.
Right, like if you're remembering an object that has a specific form, then that would be part of rupa. Okay, so these 5 things, these 5 khandas or aggregates, are the things to be held or clung to. Upadaniya dhamma. Dhamma with a long A at the end. So dhamma, in this sense, simply means a thing, an entity, something that you can say is a separate existence. Okay. So in the case of the Putrujana, his reflexive experience is fundamentally one of clinging. Remember, reflexive experience is the additional software or processing that we add to our immediate experience
on top of
at the time that it occurs. Now, if we think about something that happened in the past, or if we think about something that we would like to happen in the future, or like not to happen in the future, that's reflection. Okay?
And immediate experience recedes in the background.
Yes.
In favor of perceptions from the past and future.
Memories and imaginations. But when we have reflexive experience, this means the immediate experience seen through a certain mental filter or a certain mental processing that's going on at the time when we're experiencing that thing, in the present.
Observing your experience, like stepping back and observing it instead of being in it.
That's right. In immediate experience, the six senses are the object. Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and the mind. But in reflexive experience, the immediate experience is the object.
Yes.
Plus, there's the processing that we add to it, which, in the case of the Putujana, is clinging. Therefore, his aggregates are with clinging, sa upadana. For example, when he is experiencing feeling, Vedana, that feeling would be in combination with the consideration that the feeling is for me. Now, this is my feeling. I feel this way. So similarly with the other four aggregates, when the Putujana perceives matter or form, he feels this is my thing. This is my object.
Or at least my experience.
Yeah, but he would like actually to be the king of everything he surveys.
Yes, everything is actually mine.
Yeah, it's a great injustice that we are not recognized as the owner of everything and the controller of the world. And we shall seek to right this injustice.
Yes, by any means.
That is the goal of the ego, world domination. Similarly, when he experiences feeling, Vedana, perceptions, sanya, determinations, sankhara, and consciousness, vijnana, he experiences them in this mood of, this is mine, this is I. Especially the more subtle things, like consciousness.
Yeah.
People identify with their consciousness, and then they want their consciousness to last forever. So they invent this thing called a soul, which is a consciousness, a form of consciousness that exists eternally for a time of infinite duration. This is a really, really amazing exercise of imagination.
Yeah, because it's always, consciousness is always based on something impermanent.
That's right. And if you actually observe your consciousness, even for a few minutes, honestly, you have to admit your consciousness changes all the time.
Without your willing, often. It jumps from one thing to the next.
Right, like a monkey.
Yes.
The Buddha even uses this example. He says, like a monkey traversing a mountain slope. He's swinging from one branch to another like that. And the mind is the same way. Consciousness is the same way. It jumps from one thing to another. And sometimes it keeps the previous one and grabs the next one. And sometimes it lets go and just flies through space to the next branch and clings to that one. Monkeys are really good at clinging. Have you seen them around here?
Yeah.
When the Putujana experiences something, anything, whether it's an external object or an internal process such as feeling, perception, determination, or consciousness, he clings to it. And especially those things that are felt to be I, like consciousness, perception, feelings.
Thoughts about me.
Yes. This is I. So he clings really hard to that.
Yeah.
So as long as his reflexive experience is fundamentally one of holding or clinging, any experience that includes the reflexive component is a case of the five aggregates with clinging. And therefore, the title of this chapter and the subject that we're going to discuss now for some time is going to be the five clinging aggregates. Panchupadana Kanda. Panchu means five, and upadana means clinging, and kanda means aggregates. In Pali, see, we're not making these things up. It's all based on the Pali Suttas. But we're trying to express them in the language of modern existential philosophy, which is practically speaking, the default philosophy and way of thinking in the whole Western civilization, which means the whole world nowadays.
Everyone who's rational is an existentialist.
Yes, practically speaking. But they don't think that I am an existentialist because the values and the reasoning of existentialism,
their conclusions,
has become so deeply embedded in the culture, the language, the media, and so on, that it has actually disappeared from view. You know, the same thing is happening with computers. It used to be that a computer was a thing, you know, or a big thing. I remember when they were the size of like a couple of refrigerators, you know, and they had been miniaturized quite a bit by that time.
Now they're everywhere. Now they're subtle.
Yeah, now they're in your phone, they're in your watch, they're in your toaster, you know.
In your new Google glasses.
Yes, everywhere. Pretty soon they'll probably be in your brain, you know. They're in your car. They're,
not in my brain.
Yeah, really. They're. That's why we're here in the jungle, you know. That they have become embedded in so many things that computers, as computers, have practically disappeared. Well, the same is true of existentialism as a philosophy. It has practically disappeared. Yeah. Nobody goes around saying, I'm an existentialist. Because everybody's an existentialist. That's like saying, well, I'm a human being. Well, like, so what? Everybody's a human being. So this existentialism has become so prevalent and so deeply embedded in the culture that now, for all practical purposes, there is no competing philosophy. And you notice in the last 50 years, there has not been another serious contender for like the next philosophy, the postmodern philosophy. Existentialism is it by default.
It's adopted in the group mind.
Yep.
But not always rationally, not always completely. Most people don't think about these things very much. They kind of halfway adopt.
They assume them.
Yeah.
Yeah, they assume, for example, Nietzsche's statement that God is dead. That is an assumption of like the millennial generations now, that religion is bunk. Thinking about the great questions of life is a waste of time, because there are no real answers.
So eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die.
That seems to be the motto, like, for example, of heavy metal music. Megadeth. You know, we're all going to die. Well, yeah. But in the meantime, there are some very interesting things that we can do to become free from these conditions, free from the limitations of egoistic thinking, free from this clinging business that seems to define everybody's experience.
The problem with the existentialists is they ask the right questions, but they always had this assumption of a self.
Yes, and therefore they could not answer their questions. Their questions became unanswerable because their assumptions did not include or provide a big enough set of possibilities to include the answers. Now let's explain that. Any set of assumptions creates a realm of possibilities. Well, let's call it an opportunity set. Okay? Opportunity set is a nice term. Comes from, what's his name? Werner Erhard, in his leadership work. Because the way you set up a situation pretty much determines the range of possible outcomes.
The context is decisive.
Yes, and that is called an opportunity set. So, for example, we were discussing integrity as a factor in leadership. And one of the things that integrity does, which is very interesting, is that it tremendously expands your opportunity set for production and success. Performance, yeah, in general. Right. Your assumptions going into any particular situation determine the opportunity set, the set of possibilities that is available in that situation.
So if your assumptions are wrong, then you miss the target completely.
Well, not wrong. Assumptions can't be wrong because assumptions are correct by definition. That's what an assumption is. An assumption is a thought or condition that is assumed to be correct. It does not have to be proved. In fact, it can't be proved within the possibilities that it creates.
So what do you call it if you don't call it wrong? Faulty assumptions?
Limited assumptions. Or limiting assumptions. For example, if I make the assumption that I am a Republican, I have just limited my opportunity set. I have
to play a very small game.
Yes, right. My game is now extremely constrained by this assumption, which is unprovable. It's simply a declaration.
Would be better to be a Freemason then. You could play at both sides.
Both sides against the middle. Better yet, to say, I don't have any position. Like the Buddha.
That's what he said.
That was the Buddha. He says the Tathagata has done away with positions. He has done away with them.
And with views.
Yeah. No, not with view.
I thought...
No. A view, you can have a view without having a position. You see? A view is just a point of view where you look at something from. It doesn't mean that you're committed to it as a position. You can change your views instantly. You can change from your viewpoint from one end of the universe to the other.
Load different contexts.
Right. You can load a different context anytime. But if you have a position, you cannot do that anymore. Now you have to defend your position. You have to prove your position. You have to argue your position against other positions and so on. See, a position includes this element of commitment.
And self.
Self. In other words, this position, this is I. There's this clinging.
I can't be any other way.
That's right. So the difference between a view and a position is that the position involves clinging. The 5 clinging aggregates, in the case of the Puthujjana, his experience is always the 5 clinging aggregates. His entire being is composed of 5 clinging aggregates. And his world, or opportunity set of possibilities of consciousness, experience, and action, is bounded by the totality of the 5 clinging aggregates. He cannot experience anything outside of that. And that's why the Puthujjana cannot understand the core philosophy of the Buddha. That's why we have to start with talking about how you create the ego, how you create the possessions, how you start this clinging process, and then the 5 aggregates and so on. We have to approach it indirectly.
He's totally stuck within his own maze of eye and mind. He can't look outside of those walls.
Precisely.
Because of his assumptions.
Yes, because of his assumptions, he has a position.
And he has limited his opportunity set radically.
Right.
He misses most of what's going on.
That's right. That's right. Because I wrote a little book about this called the, what was it? Secret of Happiness or something like that. Where most people parse their incoming experience into 3 boxes, 3 categories. Good, bad, and don't care. And guess what? 95% of our experience goes into the don't care box.
Yes.
Because we're not clinging to those things. The bird is singing outside.
Doesn't even show up most of the time.
But we don't care because it's not my bird.
It's not related to your story.
It's not right. The bird is not going to make me the king of the world. I don't really care about the bird. I'm not clinging to the bird in any way. So it goes into the don't care.
You never hear it unless you're like in immediate experience or in the Seika's reflexive experience.
Right. Then I would be open to all that experience as being valid.
Like Bruce Lee when he teaches his student how to fight. It's like, do you hear the birds chirping? Listen. If you can't hear the birds, then you're not aware of your whole experience.
The
You're
birds are
limiting
going to
yourself.
tell you when the enemy is sneaking up on you, ready to ambush.
Yeah, and you're supposed to be aware of your opponent and the birds at the same time. You're supposed to be aware of your whole experience, not limit yourself to looking at your opponent's legs or
Why?
knife.
Because that's going to limit your possible responses. That's going to limit your opportunity set for victory.
If there's an ego there, then there's tension and there's fear and there's always crap.
Yeah. And again, the consciousness becomes limited. Okay? So we are always limiting our consciousness according to things we cling to. And the things we cling to are how we define our I. Because they are mine. But we went over all this in the last chapter. So now we're going to talk more about what are those things. How do we bind ourselves by clinging and limit our opportunity set for being? We haven't even started to approach the idea of going beyond being, quote unquote, false being. We're still talking about the mechanics and the software of being, quote unquote. In other words, being a phony I and mocking up this possessions. This is I and mine and my stuff and my possibilities and my experience and my this and my that.
And according to our story, we need to have some kind of sense object to be happy. And without it, we are not.
Because we need some kind of sense object even to exist. If our being, quote unquote, is defined in terms of quote I, unquote, and I is defined in terms of quote mine, unquote, then we have to have something to be mine, to have an I, to exist in order to have being.
But we choose very particular eyes.
Well,
very
of course.
particular objects that are often hard to get, when actually you could choose a simple object like the breath and have all the pleasure you wanted. If that was within the realm of possibilities for you.
That's an excellent point, which we will get to later on. Because we're not there yet.
No.
We're still trying to untangle this mess of spaghetti code called being. What most people call being. That's not what we would call being. Because real being is eternal.
It's fabricated being.
We're talking about fabricated being of the Putujana.
No. Which we also do occasionally.
No, really?
Well, I do, at least. If I don't load this ontology, if I don't establish concentration in the morning, then I can continue the whole day as a Putujana.
Oy.
But if I gather my consciousness, if I read a little bit about the aggregates, load the context, then it's like a clear day.
I'm going to try to finish this section. We're running out of time, as usual.
We will always run out of time.
Really, there's never enough time to talk about all this stuff. Weti Muni goes on, we also see that in the experience of a living being, none of these aggregates can exist by itself, separated from the others. They're inseparable. And the Venerable Sariputta says, friend, that which is feeling, that which is perception, that which is consciousness, these things are associated, not dissociated, and it is impossible to separate them from one another or show a distinction between them. For, friend, what one feels, that he perceives. What one perceives, that he cognizes. Beautiful statement.
Yeah.
I love these statements. This is from the Mahavedala Sutta.
Just reading that every morning will help you.
Yeah. So these five aggregates, the matter, perception, the feeling, determinations, and consciousness, they're all part of one thing. And that one thing is our world. That's right. Our experience.
So if you want to take over the world, just focus on the five
Our
aggregates.
possibilities of experience. Now, the Buddha also taught, monks, if one were to declare thus, I will show the coming or the going, the disappearance or the appearance, the growth or the increase or the abundance of consciousness, apart from matter, apart from feeling, apart from perceptions, apart from determinations, that situation is impossible. That's from the Upaya Sutta.
So he flies straight in the face of the Vedas.
Yes. This thing that he's talking about here is called elementalism. Elementalism means I can break up all the substances in the world into pure things isolated from each other by themselves and put them into a test tube and determine their different attributes in isolation.
Which is impossible.
It's crazy. Crazy.
They're not permanent, for one. They will always change into something else, which doesn't make them an element, really. It makes them a process, which is related to all the processes around them.
Well, you see, but this is the scientific outlook. You know, you want to study a frog, for example. So what do? You catch the frog, and you bring the frog into your laboratory, right? And now you observe the frog, right? But what are you going to observe? You're going to observe a frog in a laboratory. Yeah. And the frog is going to behave as if he's in a laboratory. And how a frog behaves in a laboratory is very different from how he behaves when he's in the swamp.
Yes.
So you don't really know the frog because you've taken him out of his normal world with his normal connections and relations and behaviors and so on. And you've put him in this artificial environment where he's separated from everything else.
If you want to know the frog, you got to go into the jungle and sit very quietly for a long time.
So the Buddha is saying, if I want to show anything about these different things, consciousness, matter, feeling, perceptions, determination, that's impossible.
They're all part of each other.
Yeah,
related to each other.
They're all linked to each other. They're all part of something, and that something is our world, our experience, the whole gestalt of what we are and how we are, who we are. It's not separable.
I think you got to define gestalt.
Gestalt. Well, let's look in the dictionary. Where is the pointer? Okay.
It's actually an English word.
Well, now it is. Psychology. An organized whole that is perceived as more than the sum of its parts. That's not a very good definition. A gestalt, and my study of psychology goes back to the 1960s. So this is probably a definition it's been influenced by behaviorism. Because the actual term gestalt, of course, comes from Jung. And Jung was not a behaviorist at all.
He was almost a mystic, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was a mystic. Gestalt actually means the indefinable, inexpressible totality of an experience, which includes not only the person himself, but all the things in the universe that he's connected to at that moment.
Gross and subtle.
Yes, a gestalt. So, yes, the idea of synchronicity comes out of that. The idea of, what is that? The whole is more than the sum of its parts.
Synergy, no?
Synergy, yeah. That's that when you put things together in relations...
2 + 2 = 5.
Yes, it does, because now you have not only the two things, but the relation between them, and that enriches the whole thing. So we're never in isolation. We are never elemental. We are always connected. We are always in a compound state, an aggregate.
Yes.
That's why the Buddha defines things in terms of aggregates. He doesn't talk much about elements at all.
No.
The idea of elementalism comes, again, from Western science and from this artificial idea that you can isolate things and determine their properties in isolation. See?
The Buddha does talk some about elements, but they're more like modes of behavior of matter.
They are modes of behavior, or modes of, what do you call that when something is moving? Momentum.
Dynamics of motion.
Yes, right. The way something moves. The way water moves is different from the way earth moves. And that's how we know the difference between them. Because it has a different kind of resistance, a different kind of momentum. It takes a different kind of effort to put it in motion. And when it is in motion, it moves differently than other things. But you see, it's not that the Buddha is trying to create a universal cosmology.
No.
He doesn't really care about that.
Yeah, he talks about elements to show that the physical experience is not self. It can be broken down into parts.
Right, and even further, he talks about anything that he talks about in the context of solving the problem of suffering. If you need to know it to solve the problem of suffering, then he's going to bring it up and discuss as much about it as you need to know to solve that problem. No more, no less.
Even as big as the sutras are, he still compared them to the leaves he was holding in his hand compared to what he knew, which was the leaves in the whole forest.
That's right. Yeah, so the Buddha is giving not a complete view of everything. No. He's not trying to create a metaphysical cosmology or anything like that.
We shouldn't try to extrapolate one from his teaching either.
Very good point. Any attempt to do that is just a waste of effort.
Yeah.
So what we're trying to do is pass on this teaching to you in a way that you can use it to solve your problem of suffering. So we may have to treat each of the aggregates separately to get an understanding of them. But actually, they're inseparable.
Yeah.
Right? So it becomes clear from this that the problem of suffering and its cessation must lie in these categories called the 5 clinging aggregates. Experience of whatever there is, at least for the Pratujana, is confined to these 5, because this is what he's clinging to. That's about it for today, because we have reached the end of the first section. So thank you for being with us.